Okay, in this podcast, I'm going to turn to Japan. I have to say, if you turn to page 83 in Story, which is chapter 39, this will really make a lot more sense. You'll understand what's going on spatially. Okay, so let's talk about Japan. Japan is the complete opposite of China by choice. Japan looked at what had happened to China and thought, this will not happen to us. In 1853, Matthew Perry, the U.S. Um, naval officer, uh, sailed into Tokyo Harbor, kind of forced his way into Tokyo Harbor, because the U.S. wanted to open up Japan, which had been a very closed society. And interestingly, the flag that he was flying in 1853 was flown from Annapolis to the USS Missouri, where the surrender ceremonies were held in 1945. So, kind of an interesting journey for that particular flag. It goes from Tokyo Harbor to a library in Annapolis to the USS Missouri in 1945. Very kind of epic move, I think, on the part of the U.S. Navy during the surrender ceremony to bring Perry's flag. It's kind of an FU to Japan, I guess. So Japan looked at what happened to China and thought, this is not going to happen to us. This is not going to happen to us. So what happened is Japan began industrializing very, very quickly. It created a constitution. It created a modern army through the draft. There was a universal conscription, which meant that all Japanese men had to serve in the military. So, unlike China, what happens in Japan is Japan becomes a modern industrial society almost overnight, let's say by 1900. And the Japanese are looking at China and they're going, this is not going to happen to us. We are not going to lose our national sovereignty like China has. Um, and Japan is also looking at China and kind of licking its lips because they see the area across the Sea of Japan, Manchuria, Korea, as being very, very resource rich. And Japan's very resource poor. Japan is small, it's an island. And when Japan looks at China, they think, well, why don't we do what the Western powers have done? Why don't we just kind of establish ourselves in China? I mean, the West did it. Why can't we? And in fact, throughout this period, Japan is talking about the hypocrisy of the West when the West is critical of what Japan's doing in China. Japan's saying, hey, we're just what you taught us, we're doing. Um, Again, I'm not an apologist for the Japanese government, but sadly, they do kind of have a point. So Japan becomes a power, and in 1894, mid 1890s. Okay, don't get too fussed on dates. Japan gains kind of informal control over Korea, and if you look at the map, you'll see Korea is very close to Japan. And then also, Japan gets formal control over the island of Taiwan. So Taiwan becomes a Japanese colony from the 1890s until the end of World War II in 1945. So Japan is actually starting to take over some territory in China. In 1905, 1904, 1905, Japan shocks the world. Japan goes to war against Russia. Russia is not real happy that Japan is moving into Manchuria. And Japan goes to war against Russia and defeats Russia. This is a very significant moment in the history of global racial relations because it's the first time an Asian power, a non white power, had defeated a European power, especially in modern times, I guess I would say. So it shocked the world. It shocked the world. And it showed how far and how fast Japan had come. Not only are they developing their army, but they also have a first class navy. So Japan defeats Russia in the early 1900s. It annexes Korea in 1910. It just grabs Korea in 1910. It starts to make Japan's not the enemy of the West. In fact, it creates a treaty with Great Britain in the early 1900s. And what happens is the Japanese what they want to do is they want resources from the Manchuria, Korea area, and there's a railroad there, the South Manchurian Railroad, and the Japanese send in an army into this area to patrol and to make sure that that railroad line never comes in under any threat. It is called the Kwantung Army, Kwantung, and I'll put this on an outline. So basically, although it controls Korea, although it doesn't control Manchuria formally, it sent troops into Manchuria to make sure that the railroad line, which was the key transportation link, goods were coming from Manchuria into the ports of Korea, and then from Korea to Japan, right? It's like I-10 or I-35. And so Japan was protecting this railroad line in Manchuria, so it has troops in Manchuria, and it has formally annexed Korea. So if you look at the map, you'll see from a geopolitical sense that this makes sense from the Japanese point of view, because Korea is right across the Sea of Japan from Japan, and then Manchuria is very nearby as well. So what you have beginning in around 1910 or so, the Japanese have gained quite a bit of control in Manchuria. They haven't formally annexed it yet. That will happen. And they haven't formally annexed Manchuria yet. Okay, they formally annexed Korea. So Korea becomes under direct Japanese control in 1910. Manchuria, there's Japanese troops in Manchuria. They're sent there ostensibly to make sure that the railroad that goes from Manchuria into Korea is always kept free from sabotage and that kind of thing, that it runs smoothly. So Japan is trying to guarantee these natural resources from China will reach Japan with the least amount of friction as possible. Japan allies with the U.S. and Great Britain during World War I. It expects to get territorial concessions in China after World War I, which doesn't happen. Japan feels betrayed. Japan is also betrayed because it introduces a revolution at Versailles which condemns racism, global racism, or the idea that white people are superior. And the Western powers reject the anti-racist clause of the Versailles Treaty, which infuriates the Japanese. And you can kind of understand why it would infuriate the Japanese. Um, um, After World War I, Japan is still active. It sends troops to fight the communists in Russia, about 70,000 troops, although they quickly leave when the communists gain control over Russia. They signed treaties with Washington that, in theory, will limit the size of the Japanese Navy, which doesn't happen. But in the 1920s, there are these treaties that are signed, which Japan later breaks. And Japan is getting more and more frustrated with the West because Japan feels like the West is kind of hemming it in. That Japan wants to act like Western powers had acted, but the West now is saying, no, you can't go into China like we did. Japan is infuriated when the racial equality clause is rejected at Versailles and then rejected when the League of Nations is created. And also in 1924, we forget this, the U.S. passed a law, U.S. government, forbidding any Japanese from immigrating to the U.S. 1924, anti-immigration law. No Japanese were allowed into the U.S. So Japan's not really happy with the West. It feels insulted, it feels degraded, and it feels like the West is acting like a bunch of hypocrites. The war in China. You know what? I'll do one more. I'll stop here and do one more podcast, and then we're done for the day.